My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 38 years old, and the story I'm about to tell you begins at a gas station off Route 9 in rural Kentucky on a Tuesday afternoon in July when I was 7 years old. It ends 20 years later in a nursing home intake office with a pen in my hand and a decision I'd been unknowingly preparing for my entire life. I want to be clear before I say anything else. I'm not telling you this story because I'm angry. I'm past angry. I'm telling you because I know there are people listening right now who have been told, in one way or another, that their pain was a lesson, that being left behind was for their own good, that love sometimes looks like abandonment, and abandonment sometimes looks like discipline. I want you to know what it actually looks like 20 years later. I want you to see the whole picture. So, let me take you back to that gas station. It was a Tuesday in July. My parents were Harold and Connie Callahan. My father was a man who believed in what he called character building. He used that phrase the way other people use a weapon, casually, repeatedly, aimed directly at whoever needed to be cut down to size. My mother was not a cruel woman by nature. She was a quiet woman, the kind of quiet that gets mistaken for peace, but is actually just fear dressed up in a floral blouse. She let my father do what my father did, and she called it trust. She called it support. She called it marriage. I was 7. My brother Caleb was 11. We were driving back from my grandmother's house in Elizabethtown, 2 hours from home, because Grandma Rue had just turned 60 and there'd been a birthday dinner with yellow cake and sweet tea and the kind of afternoon that should have ended warm. It didn't. Somewhere around mile marker 40, I made a mistake. I don't even remember what the mistake was exactly. I've turned it over in my mind hundreds of times across 30 years, and I genuinely cannot reconstruct it. I think I spilled something, or I touched Caleb's Nintendo DS without asking, or maybe I just asked a question at the wrong time in the wrong voice with the wrong amount of need in it. That was often enough with my father. What I remember is this: his eyes in the rearview mirror. Not angry exactly. Something worse than angry. Flat. Decided. He pulled off the highway without saying a word, took the exit ramp slow, the way a man does when he's already made up his mind and he wants you to feel every second of the distance between where you were and where you're about to be. It was a Sunoco station, one pump, a sun-bleached awning, a man in a red cap filling his truck. I remember the smell, gasoline and cut grass and something frying from a diner across the road. Dad put the car in park, turned around, looked at me directly for the first time since whatever I'd done. "Get out!" I laughed. I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. Children believe in the foundational safety of their parents with a certainty that is almost violent. It doesn't occur to you at 7 that the joke isn't a joke. "I said get out, Nora. You need a lesson in how good you have it." Mom was looking out the passenger window. I remember that specifically. She didn't turn her head. Her hands were folded in her lap like a woman in a waiting room. Caleb was watching me with eyes that already knew something I didn't. I got out of the car. I stood on the concrete next to the pump with my white sneakers and my yellow shorts, and my fists balled up at my sides the way kids do when they're trying very hard not to cry, because crying will only make it worse. The door closed. The car pulled out, and then it was just me and the Sunoco station and the man in the red cap, who had stopped filling his truck and was now watching me with an expression I didn't have words for at 7 but could name perfectly by 30. Pity. Bottomless, useless pity. I don't know how long I stood there. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Long enough for the man in the red cap to ask me if I was okay. Long enough for me to say yes, because that was already the answer I'd been trained to give. Long enough for the woman behind the counter inside to offer me a paper cup of water and a look that said she'd seen things in that station she wished she hadn't. My father came back. Of course he came back. That's the part people always assume. Well, he came back, so it couldn't have been that bad. As if the return erases the leaving. As if coming back makes the abandoned child feel found rather than simply retrieved. He didn't say he was sorry. He pulled up to the pump, looked at me through the windshield for a moment, then leaned across and pushed open the back door from the inside. "Get in. I hope you learned something." I got in. I buckled my seatbelt. I stared out the window the entire rest of the way home, and I made myself a promise without fully understanding that I was making it. The kind of promise that lives in your chest instead of your head. Quiet, patient, not yet ready to be named. That wasn't the only time. I want to say it was, because there's a part of me that still wants to give my father the smallest possible amount of fault he can get away with. Old habits. But it wasn't the only time. There were variations, smaller versions. He left me at a mall once when I was 9, told me to find my own way to the food court and think about why I was difficult. He left me at a Little League field at 11 when I'd embarrassed him in front of another dad by asking to go home early because I wasn't feeling well. He left me at a church parking lot at 13 after I'd said something back to him in front of his friends. Always in public. Always with a stated reason. Always framed afterward as the lesson. What I learned from those lessons was not what he intended to teach me. I learned that I was disposable. I learned that love had conditions and the conditions could change without warning. I learned to read rooms, to measure silences, to calculate the precise distance between a man's patience and his limit. I learned to make myself small, and then smaller still, until I occupied the least possible amount of space in any room where Harold Callahan was also present. I also learned, and this one took much longer, that the instincts you build in survival mode don't disappear when the danger does. They just wait. They go quiet, and they sharpen themselves, and they wait. By the time I was 27, I had built a career on those instincts. I was a licensed social worker specializing in elder care placement. I helped families find nursing homes for aging parents. I'd walked hundreds of families through the intake process, the paperwork, the facility tours, the hard conversations. I was very, very good at my job, and I had no idea, not yet, that one day I would use every skill I'd learned in that career to navigate the moment my own parents would need exactly what I had spent my entire professional life arranging for other people's families. That moment was coming. But first, you need to understand what the 20 years in between actually looked like. Before I continue, if this story is landing somewhere real for you, if you've sat in the back of a car and watched a parent drive away and told yourself it was fine, please take a second to like and subscribe. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I want to know where you are. I want to know I'm not just talking into the dark. Now, let me show you what those 20 years were made of. People always want the gas station story to be the worst of it. They want it to be the defining moment, the single unforgettable cruelty that explains everything that came after. It's neater that way. One wound, one scar, one villain standing at a Sunoco pump in July. But that's not how it works in houses like ours. In houses like ours, it's not one thing. It's the accumulation. It's the 10,000 tiny moments that don't individually qualify as abuse, but stack up so quietly, so consistently, over so many years, that by the time you're old enough to name what happened to you, the pile is so high you can't even see over the top of it. You just know it's there. You feel its shadow every single morning when you wake up. So let me show you what those 20 years were actually made of. Not the gas station. Everything else. My father, Harold Callahan, was a high school football coach for 31 years. Winfield County High School. 12 winning seasons. 2 regional championships. A trophy case in the main hallway with his name engraved on a placard that read, Coach Harold Callahan, building champions since 1987. The community loved him. Parents trusted him with their sons. Players called him Coach H and said things at retirement banquets like, he taught me what it meant to be a man. He was firm, they said. Old school. He believed in accountability. He didn't accept excuses. At home, accountability looked like this. When I was 9, I got a B- on a science test. My father sat across from me at the kitchen table, took the test from my hands, studied it for a moment, and then set it down very deliberately between us. What's this? It's my test. I know what it is. I'm asking what it means. I told him I'd gotten confused on the last section, that I'd run out of time, that I'd studied, but some of the questions were different from what I'd expected. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he stood up, took the test, folded it once, and put it on the refrigerator with a magnet. not to celebrate it, to display it, like a warning. "Every time you open the fridge," he said, "you'll remember what happens when you don't work hard enough." It stayed there for 6 weeks. I started going to bed hungry some nights rather than open the refrigerator door and see it. Caleb was different. Not because Caleb was a better person. He was 11 years old. He was whatever the house made him. But because my father had decided before either of us could walk that Caleb was the point of the whole enterprise, the heir, the legacy, the boy who would carry the Callahan name somewhere worth carrying it. Caleb got the benefit of the doubt, always, reflexively, the way breathing is reflexive. When Caleb failed a test, Dad sat with him at the table for 2 hours and went through every problem. Patient, focused. "Let's figure out where you went wrong, son." When Caleb got in a fight at school in 7th grade and was suspended for 2 days, Dad told the principal the other kid had probably had it coming. When Caleb quit the travel baseball team mid-season because he didn't feel like going anymore, Dad said, "Sometimes you realize something isn't your path. That takes self-awareness." I quit the school choir in 8th grade because rehearsals conflicted with the housework schedule I'd been assigned. Dinner dishes, bathroom scrubbing, vacuuming the upstairs hallway, all of which fell to me because Caleb had football practice and couldn't be expected to manage both. When I told my mother I was quitting choir, she nodded and said, "That's probably for the best anyway." I had a solo in the spring concert. I'd been working on it for 2 months. No one asked about it again. My mother, Connie. I have spent more hours than I can count trying to understand my mother, and I think I've finally reached a version of understanding that is honest without being either too generous or too cruel. My mother was not a monster. She was something harder to name than that. A woman who had decided, somewhere early and somewhere deep, that her survival depended on her husband's approval, and that his approval depended on her total alignment with his worldview. She had fused herself to him so completely that by the time I was old enough to need her to intervene, there was no separate her left to appeal to. She wasn't on his side. She had simply ceased to have a side of her own. When I was 12, I came to her crying after my father had spent 45 minutes telling me in careful detail everything I did wrong, everything I cost them, and everything about my personality that would make my life harder than it needed to be. It was the kind of talk that dressed itself up as concern but landed like demolition. I sat on the edge of her bed. She was folding laundry. "Mom, he makes me feel like I'm nothing." She folded a pillowcase, set it on the pile, picked up another one. "Your father works very hard for this family, Nora. He has high standards because he believes in you." I sat with that for a moment. That doesn't feel like believing in me. It feels like hating me. She finally looked at me then, and for just a second, one single second, I saw something move across her face. Recognition, maybe. Or guilt. Something that knew what I was saying was true. Then she picked up another pillowcase and folded it, and the moment closed like water over a stone, and she said, "You're being dramatic." I stopped bringing her my pain after that. There was nowhere for it to go. There was one person. There is always one person in these stories, and if you've lived a version of this story yourself, I hope you had one too. Because I don't know how you survive it without someone who sees you clearly. Mine was Grandma Rue, my father's mother, which I know sounds strange. She was his mother, and she had somehow produced him, and I spent years being confused by that contradiction before I understood that children don't always become what their parents intended, and parents don't always understand what they've built. Grandma Rue lived 40 minutes away in Elizabethtown. She was a small woman with large hands and a way of looking at you that made you feel like the only person in a crowded room. She made biscuits from scratch every Sunday morning. She kept a jar of hard candy on her kitchen counter that was never empty. She called me her Nora with an emphasis on the her that I felt in my sternum every single time. She also saw exactly what was happening in our house. She didn't pretend otherwise. When I was 14, she sat across from me at her kitchen table while I helped her shell butter beans, and she said, without looking up from her work, "Your daddy is a man who never learned how to be soft. That's his failing, baby, not yours. Don't you carry it." I didn't fully understand what she was giving me in that moment. I do now. She was handing me the first piece of the foundation I would eventually stand on. It was small. It was quiet. It was exactly enough to keep me from disappearing entirely. I left home at 18. I want to say it was dramatic. A slammed door, a final confrontation, a moment of cinematic clarity where I looked my father in the eye and told him everything I'd stored up for 11 years. That would make a better story. The truth is quieter and somehow worse. I left on a Wednesday morning in August while my father was at football practice and my mother was at her book club. I had a duffel bag with 2 changes of clothes, my Social Security card, a scholarship letter from the University of Kentucky, and $43 in a Ziploc bag that Grandma Rue had pressed into my hand the week before without explanation. Caleb was home. He was in his room playing video games. I stood in his doorway for a moment. "I'm leaving." He looked up from the screen. Something passed over his face. Not quite guilt, not quite relief. Something uncomfortable that he didn't know what to do with. "Okay," he said. And I walked out. My parents did not call for 4 days. When my mother finally reached me on my cell phone, her first question was not, "Are you okay?" It was, "Did you take the good set of bath towels from the hallway closet? Your father can't find them." I had not taken the towels. I told her so. She said all right then and hung up. That was the goodbye I got. $43, a duffel bag, and a question about towels. I drove to Lexington with the windows down and the radio loud, and I did not cry until I reached the city limits. Then I cried for about 20 minutes, pulled into a gas station. The irony was not lost on me, even then, and washed my face in the bathroom sink and looked at myself in the mirror above the paper towel dispenser. I was 18 years old. I had no one waiting for me. I had no safety net. I had a scholarship, a Ziploc bag of cash, and a set of instincts sharpened by a decade of learning to read the weather of a difficult man. I told my reflection what Grandma Rue had told me. "That's his failing, not yours. Don't you carry it." Then I got back in the car and drove toward my life. Here is something nobody tells you about surviving a childhood like mine. The skills you build don't disappear when you leave. They don't dissolve the moment you cross the city limits with your windows down and your $43 in a Ziploc bag. They come with you. They unpack themselves quietly into your new life and set up residence in places you don't immediately notice. In the way you read a room, in the way you anticipate conflict, in the way you can sit with someone else's pain without flinching because you spent your entire childhood learning to absorb pain without making a sound. For a long time, I thought those skills were damage, evidence of everything that had been done wrong. It took me years to understand they were also tools. I arrived at the University of Kentucky in August with a scholarship for social work and a dorm room the size of a generous closet. My roommate was a girl named Priya from Louisville who had 2 parents who called her every night and sent her care packages with homemade snacks and handwritten notes. I watched her unpack those boxes the first week of school with a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not envy exactly. Something adjacent to it. A recognition of an absence so familiar it had stopped feeling like loss and started feeling like weather. I studied hard. I worked a part-time job at the university library. I called Grandma Rue every Sunday from a payphone outside the student union because I didn't have a calling plan and she didn't have email, and some things are worth the inconvenience. She asked me every week how I was eating, whether I was sleeping, whether I'd found one person worth talking to. She said that was all you needed to start. Just one. I found Priya eventually in the way that real friendships find you, slowly and then all at once. She became the first person since Grandma Rue who knew my actual story and didn't try to fix it or minimize it or tell me my father probably meant well. She just listened. And then she handed me a piece of her mother's homemade chocolate and said, "That sounds exhausting. You should eat something." I have loved her for 20 years for that. I graduated with my BSW at 22 and went directly into a master's program on a partial fellowship. My thesis was on emotional labor in elder care environments, specifically the toll placed on social workers who serve as the primary emotional support for both aging patients and their families simultaneously. I wrote it in 8 months. My advisor said it was one of the most instinctively empathetic pieces of research she'd read in a decade. I didn't tell her that I'd essentially been practicing emotional labor management since I was 7 years old, standing at a Sunoco pump in July, learning to hold my face completely still. I got licensed. I got hired by a placement agency in Louisville that specialized in elder care transitions, helping families navigate the process of moving an aging parent out of the family home and into the appropriate level of care: assisted living, memory care, skilled nursing facilities, the full spectrum. The work was hard, not physically, though the hours were long, but emotionally. Families arrived in my office in every possible configuration of grief, denial, guilt, and relief. Some came in crying before they sat down. Some came in angry, looking for someone to blame for the fact that their parent was no longer who they'd been. Some came in so dissociated from the reality of the situation that my job was essentially to gently reintroduce them to what was actually happening in front of them. I was good at all of it, genuinely, measurably good. Within 3 years, I was the agency's most requested caseworker. Families asked for me specifically. They said things in their exit surveys like she made us feel like she understood, and she never made us feel judged, and she knew exactly what to say when we didn't know what to feel. I understood because I did. I didn't make them feel judged because I knew what it felt like to be held to a standard designed for failure. I knew what to say because I had spent my entire childhood studying the precise emotional temperature of difficult rooms and learning how to move through them without breaking anything. Harold Callahan built a champion. He just didn't build the one he intended. My parents re-entered my life when I was 27. Not because anything changed between us. Not because my father called to say he'd been thinking about July 1993 and he finally understood what he'd done. Not because my mother had found, after all these years, a side of her own to stand on. They came back because Caleb was getting married. His fiancée was a woman named Bryn. Lovely, warm, entirely unaware of our family's specific architecture of damage. She wanted a real wedding with a real family and a real photo that looked the way wedding photos are supposed to look. She wanted the whole Callahan family present, together, smiling, because she loved Caleb and she assumed that loving Caleb meant inheriting something functional. My mother called me on a Thursday evening. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. She started the conversation as though we'd spoken the week before. "Caleb's engaged. The wedding is in June. We'd like you to come." I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment. "How are you, Mom?" A pause. "Fine. We're all fine. Will you come?" That was it. No acknowledgement of the 2 years. No acknowledgement of the $43 and the question about the bath towels. No acknowledgement of anything that had happened in the 20 years before that. Just, "Will you come?" As though I were a distant acquaintance being invited to fill a seat. I went. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't for my parents. It wasn't even entirely for Caleb, though I had spent years holding a complicated and unresolved love for my brother. A love mixed with old resentment and the grief of watching someone become comfortable with a privilege they never had to name. I went for Bryn, who deserved a wedding that wasn't sabotaged by an absent sister-in-law's complicated history. And I went because Grandma Rue was going, and the idea of being in the same room as Grandma Rue after 2 years away was enough to outweigh almost anything. The wedding was in June. It was beautiful, as weddings tend to be when someone genuinely good is at the center of them. Bryn was radiant. Caleb cried at the altar, which surprised me, because I'd spent so many years seeing him through the lens of the boy who'd said okay when I left that I'd forgotten he was also capable of being fully human. My parents were there. My father in a dark suit, silver-haired now, heavier than I remembered. My mother in a blue dress, her hands folded in her lap during the ceremony the way they'd been folded in the car that July afternoon, and for one disorienting moment I was 7 years old again, and the ceremony disappeared entirely. Then Grandma Rue found my hand in the dark of the church and squeezed it once, hard, and I came back. My father and I spoke for approximately 6 minutes at the reception. He told me I looked well. I told him he looked well. He asked what I was doing for work. I told him elder care social work. He nodded as though this was acceptable, the way you nod at a stranger's job when you can't think of anything to say about it. He did not ask how I was. He did not say, "I'm glad you came." He did not say anything that acknowledged, even sideways, that I was his daughter standing in front of him after 2 years of silence. What he said, right before he moved away toward the bar, was this: "That's good work. That elder care stuff. Important. Somebody's got to do it." I watched him walk away, and I thought, in the most distant, almost academic way, yes, somebody does. I had absolutely no idea, standing there in my brother's wedding reception with a glass of champagne and 6 minutes of small talk behind me, that the thing my father had just casually called important would become the exact mechanism through which our entire story would finally resolve itself. That was 11 years away, but it was coming. And I would be ready. The first sign came 2 years after the wedding. A phone call from Caleb, the first real phone call we'd had in years. Not a surface-level text, not a happy holidays, but an actual call. His voice carrying something I recognized immediately from my professional life. Fear dressed up as practicality. "Hey, so Dad had a fall." In my profession, we have a word for what happened next. We call it the cascade. It's the moment when an aging parent's health stops declining gradually and starts declining in chapters. One thing leads to another thing leads to another thing, and suddenly the family that had been managing, telling themselves everything was fine, that Dad was just slowing down, that Mom was just a little more forgetful than last year. Suddenly, that family is standing in a hospital hallway at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, realizing that fine was a story they'd been telling themselves, and the story is over now. I had walked hundreds of families through the cascade. I knew its shape. I knew its timing. I knew the particular quality of panic in a person's voice when they finally understood that the parent they thought they had years left with was now a different kind of problem than the one they'd been preparing for. What I did not know, what no amount of professional experience fully prepares you for, is what it feels like when the family in the cascade is yours. Even when yours is the word you use loosely, even when yours comes with asterisks. Caleb's call came on a Thursday evening in October. I was at my kitchen table eating leftover soup and reviewing a placement file for a client whose family had been stalling on a decision for 6 weeks. My phone lit up with his name, and I almost didn't answer, because our relationship at that point was still mostly surface. Holiday texts, the occasional birthday message, the performative warmth of two people who share a history they've agreed not to discuss. But I answered, and his voice told me immediately that this was not a surface call. "Hey, so, Dad had a fall." I set down my spoon, switched into the part of my brain that stays level. "When?" "This morning. He was coming down the stairs and his knee gave out. He's okay. I mean, he's not okay. He broke his wrist and they think maybe a hairline fracture in his hip, but he's stable. He's at St. Joseph's. Has he had balance issues before this?" A pause. "I mean, yeah, actually. For a while. He's been kind of, I don't know, shuffling. Mom kept saying it was just his back. I knew what shuffling meant in a man my father's age. I didn't say that yet. What do the doctors say? That's kind of why I'm calling." Another pause, longer this time, with something embarrassed buried inside it. "They want to run some neurological tests, and I don't really know what that means, and Bryn looked some stuff up online and now she's scared, and Mom is just, you know how Mom is. She's just saying he's fine and the doctors are being dramatic." I knew how Mom was. "Yes, Caleb." I kept my voice even. "I need you to get me the name of his attending physician, and I need you to ask them specifically whether they're screening for Parkinson's or early-stage vascular dementia. Can you do that?" A long silence. Do you think that's what it is?" "I think you need the information before you can do anything useful with it. Get me the doctor's name." He got me the doctor's name. It was neither Parkinson's nor vascular dementia, as it turned out. What it was, what the cascade began with, in my father's case, was a combination of moderate osteoarthritis in both knees, early-stage peripheral neuropathy that had been quietly eroding his balance for the better part of 2 years. and a cardiac arrhythmia that nobody had caught because my father had not been to a doctor for a routine physical in 11 years. 11 years. The man had not had a routine physical in 11 years because he felt fine and he didn't believe in making problems where there weren't any. There were problems. The arrhythmia was manageable with medication, but it needed monitoring. The neuropathy was progressive. The osteoarthritis meant that the stairs in the house where I'd grown up, the house with 4 bedrooms and the family portrait in the living room, and the refrigerator where my B- test had lived for 6 weeks, those stairs were now a genuine danger. The doctors recommended a single-story living situation, a home modification assessment, a physical therapy regimen, a follow-up cardiology appointment within 30 days. My mother responded to all of this by repainting the downstairs bathroom. This is the part of the story where I want to be precise, because it would be easy to tell it wrong. My parents did not suddenly become warm. They did not call me to reconnect. They did not look at the situation and feel, finally, the specific regret that I had spent 20 years waiting for them to feel. There was no moment of reckoning, no conversation over hospital coffee, no father looking at his daughter across a waiting room and saying, "I see now what I did." What happened was simpler and more honest than that. They needed me because I was useful. That's it. That is the complete explanation. I was a licensed social worker who specialized in exactly the kind of crisis they were now facing. I knew the systems. I knew the terminology. I knew which questions to ask and which forms to file, and which facilities had good inspection records and which ones looked good in the brochure but smelled like neglect in the hallways. I was, in the most transactional possible sense, the most valuable person they had access to. And so they called. My mother called first, 3 days after Caleb's initial call, while my father was still in the hospital. Her voice had the particular tone I recognized from childhood, the one she used when she needed something and was hoping I wouldn't notice that needing something was the entire reason for the call. "Your father is coming home on Friday. Caleb thinks we should talk to someone about arrangements. He mentioned you might know about these things." "I do know about these things." "Well," a pause. "Would you be willing to help?" I want to tell you I said something sharp here, something that named what was happening. The years of silence, the bath towel question, the gas station, all of it, and forced her to reckon with the audacity of calling me useful after spending my entire childhood making me feel disposable. I didn't say any of that. I said, "Yes, I can help." Because here's the thing about growing up the way I grew up. You learn the difference between the battles that cost you something real and the ones that are just satisfying in the moment. I had fought the satisfying battles in my head 1,000 times. I'd rehearsed every version of that conversation, alone, in my car, in the shower, in the specific quiet of 3 in the morning when the old wounds opened themselves back up without asking permission. I was done with the rehearsal. I wanted the real thing, and the real thing required patience. So I said yes. I drove to Elizabethtown on a Friday. I walked into the house I'd grown up in for the first time in 9 years, and I stood in the kitchen while my mother made coffee, and my father sat in the living room recliner with his wrist in a cast, looking smaller than I remembered, and I did what I was trained to do. I assessed the situation. What I found was this. The house was not safe for a man with my father's conditions. The stairs were the obvious issue, but there were others. The bathtub with no grab bars, the cluttered hallway with the side table that jutted out at exactly the height to catch a shuffling foot, the kitchen with the step down into the breakfast nook that I'd navigated my entire childhood without thinking, and now looked at with the eyes of someone who knew exactly what a fall in a kitchen could cost a 71-year-old man with a cardiac condition. My mother had lived in the house so long she'd stopped seeing any of it. My father, for his part, sat in his recliner and watched me move through his house with an expression I had never seen on his face before. I catalogued it carefully, the way I catalog everything. It was not gratitude. It was not warmth. It was something more uncomfortable than either of those. It was the look of a man who is beginning to understand that the person he underestimated is now the person standing between him and a very specific kind of helplessness. He didn't say anything. He watched me measure the hallway width with a tape measure I'd brought from my car. He watched me photograph the bathroom. He watched me open my laptop at his kitchen table and pull up the state's care facility database with the practiced ease of someone who does this for a living. And then, for the first time in my adult life, Harold Callahan said something to me that wasn't an assessment or a criticism, or a performance of fatherhood for an audience. He said quietly from his recliner, not quite looking at me, "You turned out all right, Nora." I kept my eyes on my laptop screen. "I know," I said, and I kept working. The 2 years that followed my father's fall were the strangest of my life. Not because they were the hardest, I had survived harder. Not because they were the most painful, that ground had been covered long ago, by a 7-year-old girl at a Sunoco pump who learned too early that love was not guaranteed. They were strange because of the particular quality of the role I found myself playing, the specific shape of what was being asked of me. I had become essential to people who had never once made me feel essential, and I had to decide every single day what to do with that. Let me walk you through the 2 years honestly, because the honest version is more complicated than the clean version, and I think you deserve the complicated one. My father's neuropathy progressed on the schedule his neurologist had predicted, steadily, without drama, the way the worst things often move. By the end of the first year, he was using a cane. By the middle of the second year, the cane had become a walker on bad days. The cardiac arrhythmia stayed controlled on medication, but required quarterly monitoring, which meant quarterly appointments, which meant someone needed to drive him because my mother had quietly stopped driving on highways sometime in the past 3 years, and nobody had formally acknowledged this yet. Nobody formally acknowledged a lot of things in my family. It was a practiced skill, the not acknowledging. They had been doing it since before I was born. Caleb drove them to appointments when he could, but Caleb had Bryn and 2 young children by now. A boy named Marcus, who was 4, and a girl named Lily, who was 2, and who had, from the single photograph I'd seen, Grandma Rue's eyes, which did something unexpected to my chest the first time I noticed it. Caleb was stretched. He called me every 2 weeks with updates that got progressively more strained, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had grown up as the favored child and was now confronting the reality that being the favored child had not actually prepared him for anything. He was learning, in real time, how to manage what I had managed my entire life, the emotional labor of existing in close proximity to Harold and Connie Callahan and absorbing everything that proximity cost. I watched him figure this out with a feeling I'm not entirely proud of. Not satisfaction exactly. Something quieter. The recognition of a person who has been told for decades that what they carried wasn't heavy. Finally watching someone else try to lift it. It was heavy. It had always been heavy. My mother's decline announced itself the way these things often do, through small inconsistencies that were individually explainable and collectively impossible to ignore. She called me in March of the first year to ask what time my father's cardiology appointment was. I told her 2 o'clock. She called me again 40 minutes later to ask the same question, and when I told her I'd already told her, she said briskly, "I know that. I just wanted to confirm," and moved on so quickly that I filed it away but didn't pull it back out immediately. In July, she asked me, twice in one conversation, whether Caleb's daughter was walking yet. In September, she told me the same story about a neighbor's dog 3 times in the span of one phone call, each time with the fresh energy of someone telling it for the first time. In November, I drove down for Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving I'd attended in 11 years, because Bryn had asked me personally, and I had decided that Bryn asking me personally was a different category of invitation than my parents needing me to fill a seat. And I watched my mother set the table and then stand in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, looking at the dining room with an expression I recognized from my professional life. She was trying to remember whether she'd already set the table. She had. She had set it 20 minutes earlier. I went to stand beside her. I didn't make a production of it. I just stood next to her in the doorway and said, "The table looks beautiful, Mom," and steered her gently toward the kitchen with a hand on her elbow, the way I would steer any client's family member who needed redirecting without being made to feel redirected. She let me, and for just a moment she looked at me with something uncomplicated in her eyes. Just gratitude, clean and simple, the way a child looks at someone who helped them without making them feel small. I thought about the pillowcase. You're being dramatic. I thought about the bath towels. Then I went and helped Bryn finish the mashed potatoes and didn't think about it again until I was driving home that night, alone on the highway, and the thinking came all at once the way it does when you've been holding it at arm's length all day. My mother was declining. My father was declining. And I was the only person in the family who knew exactly what that meant, exactly where it was going, and exactly what would need to happen when it got there. I started researching facilities in January of the second year. Not urgently. There was no crisis yet, no precipitating event. But with the quiet, methodical thoroughness of someone who knows that the time to prepare is before you need to, not after. I knew the facilities in Louisville well. I knew their inspection histories, their staff turnover rates, their Medicare ratings, their reputation among the social work community that operates in the spaces families don't see. I knew which ones had genuine culture and which ones had good marketing. I knew which memory care wings had the kind of staff who learned residents' names in the first week, and which ones had staff who learned them eventually, maybe if the resident was easy. I was not looking for eventually maybe. I built a short list of 4 facilities within 30 miles of Elizabethtown. I visited all 4 in person on separate days, unannounced, the way I always advise families to visit, because a facility on a scheduled tour shows you its best face, but a facility on a Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock shows you its actual one. 3 of the 4 were adequate. One of them, a place called Meadow Ridge, a mid-sized facility on the eastern edge of town with a memory care wing that smelled like someone actually opened the windows and a common room where 2 staff members were sitting with residents doing a word puzzle at 2 in the afternoon on a random Tuesday. One of them was genuinely good. I put Meadow Ridge at the top of the list. I kept the file in a folder on my desktop labeled with my parents' names. I didn't tell Caleb yet. I didn't tell anyone. I just waited for the cascade to reach the chapter I knew was coming. It came in April. My father fell again. Not on the stairs this time. They'd finally agreed to move the bedroom to the downstairs office after 6 months of Caleb and me presenting the case with the patience of people who had been told no many times before. He fell in the backyard, reaching for a rake he had absolutely no business picking up. And this time, the damage was more serious. Hip fracture. Surgery. A rehabilitation stay at a short-term skilled nursing facility that was covered by Medicare for 20 days and then, abruptly, administratively, was not. While my father was in rehabilitation, my mother was alone in the house for the first time in 40 years of marriage. Caleb checked on her daily. I called every morning. Bryn brought her meals twice a week with the generosity of a person who was raised by people who showed love through feeding others. And still, on the 9th day, my mother left the stove on for 4 hours while she napped. The neighbor smelled it and called Caleb. Nothing caught fire. Nothing was damaged beyond a ruined pot and a smoke-stained wall above the burner. But something had shifted. We all felt it. The story we'd been telling ourselves, that things were difficult but manageable, that we had more time, that the right moment was still somewhere ahead of us. That story ended with a ruined pot and a smoke-stained wall on a Thursday afternoon in April. I called Caleb that evening. It's time to talk about the next step. A long silence. Then, quietly, the sound of a man setting down whatever armor he'd been carrying. I know. I want to tell you about the intake appointment, the actual day, the room. It was a Wednesday in May. Meadow Ridge had an intake coordinator named Patricia. 50s, efficient, genuinely kind in the way that the best people in this profession are kind, which is practically rather than performatively. She'd arranged for a facility tour followed by a paperwork session, which is standard. My parents sat across the table from Patricia. I sat beside them slightly apart because I was there in 2 capacities simultaneously. As a family member and as someone who understood every word of what Patricia was saying and every implication of every form on the table, and I needed to be useful in both roles without collapsing them into each other. My father looked at the forms for a long moment. Then he looked at me. You've done this before. Not a question. Many times. For other people's parents. Yes. He looked back at the forms. Something moved across his face. Complicated and private, the way emotions are when they arrive too late to be acted on but too real to be dismissed. And now you're doing it for us. I held his gaze for a moment, steady, unhurried. The way I'd learned to hold difficult moments, not flinching away from them, not collapsing into them. Yes, I said. Now I'm doing it for you. He nodded once, slowly, and then he picked up the pen. My father moved into Meadow Ridge on a Saturday in June. My mother moved in 3 weeks later, after a care assessment confirmed what the rest of us already knew, that living alone was no longer safe, that the smoke-stained wall above the stove was not an isolated incident, but a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had been writing itself for years. They were placed in a shared suite in the assisted living wing, 2 rooms connected by a sitting area, which Bryn decorated with things from the house so it would feel like theirs. The blue lamp from the bedroom, the quilt my mother had made in her 40s and kept folded on the cedar chest, the family portrait from the living room, the one where I'm standing at the edge of the frame, half a step behind everyone else, like an afterthought, like someone the photographer almost forgot to include. I noticed that Bryn hung it on the wall. I noticed that she positioned it across from the window so it caught the morning light. I didn't say anything. I just stood in the doorway of that suite on moving day and looked at that portrait for a long moment, at 7-year-old me at the edge of the frame, and I thought about everything that photograph had never known it was documenting. Then I helped carry boxes, and I didn't think about it again until later. I want to be honest about what the intake day was and what it wasn't. It was not a triumph. I want to name that clearly because I think there is a version of this story that gets told as triumph. The abandoned child returns as the powerful adult. The parent who discarded her now depends on her completely, and the audience is supposed to feel the satisfaction of a scale finally balancing. I understand why that version is satisfying. I understand the appetite for it. But that's not what I felt sitting in that intake office with my father's pen moving across those forms. What I felt was something much quieter and much harder to name. A kind of completion that had nothing to do with victory. Like finishing a very long book that you started in childhood and finally understanding on the last page what the whole thing was actually about. Not happiness exactly, not vindication. Something more like resolution. The particular stillness that comes when a thing that has been unfinished for a very long time finally closes. I had not engineered this moment. That is important to me, and I need you to understand it. I had not spent 20 years building toward a specific revenge. I had not maneuvered my parents into dependency. I had simply lived my life, worked hard, built something real, become genuinely skilled at something genuinely important. And the life I had built happened to be precisely the life my parents needed when their own lives began requiring help they couldn't provide for themselves. That is not revenge. That is something stranger and more instructive than revenge. That is consequence. My father said something to me on his 3rd day at Meadow Ridge. I had come by after work to check on the transition. Standard practice for the first week. I would have done it for any client. And I found him sitting in the chair by the window in his room, looking out at the facility's garden. The late afternoon light was coming in at an angle that made everything look gentler than it was. I sat in the chair across from him. We were quiet for a moment, the way you can be quiet with someone when all the things that needed to be said have been said or have aged past the point of saying. Then he looked at me, not through me, not past me, not at a version of me that confirmed something he'd already decided, directly at me, the way you look at a person when you are finally ready to see them. I left you at that gas station, he said. I didn't move. I've thought about it a lot over the years. His voice was even, careful, the voice of a man choosing words with the deliberate effort of someone who doesn't do it naturally. I told myself it was discipline. I told myself you needed to understand consequences. He paused. I've been in this place 3 days, and I've had a lot of time to sit here and think about the things I told myself. I waited. It wasn't discipline, he said. It was, I didn't know how to be what you needed, and instead of learning, I made it your problem. He looked back out the window. That's not something a father should do. The room was very quiet. I want to tell you I had a response ready. Something measured and articulate and exactly right. The kind of thing you say in the version of this moment you've rehearsed in your head for 30 years. I want to tell you I delivered it cleanly and it landed exactly as intended, and we both felt the precise closure the moment called for. What actually happened is that I sat there for a long moment without saying anything at all. Because the truth is that some moments are too real for the rehearsed version. Some things arrive after so long that you don't have a container for them anymore. You just have to sit with them as they are. Finally, I said, I know it wasn't discipline. He nodded. He didn't ask for forgiveness. I respected that. Asking for forgiveness at this point would have been about his comfort, not mine. And somewhere in his 71 years, he had apparently learned that distinction, or arrived at it, or been delivered to it by 3 days in a chair by a window with nothing to do but think. "You turned out better than I deserved," he said. "I turned out the way I turned out," I said, "despite some things and because of others." He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile I had seen on Harold Callahan's face directed at me in 38 years of living. "Fair," he said. We sat together in the quiet for another 20 minutes. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Some reconciliations are not dramatic. Some of them are just two people sitting in a room in the late afternoon light, finally out of the energy it takes to be at war. Grandma Rue died in August. Peacefully in her own home in Elizabethtown in the early morning, the way she had always said she wanted. Quietly, baby, like closing a book. She left me a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, on the same lavender paper she'd used for 30 years of birthday cards. I won't share all of it because it belongs to me in a way that some things just belong to you and aren't meant to be handed to anyone else. But there is one part I'll give you. She wrote, I watched you from the very beginning, my Nora. I watched them try to make you small, and I watched you quietly refuse to become it, even when you didn't know that's what you were doing. You thought you were surviving. You were actually building. There is a difference, and one day you will see it clearly. I believe that day has come or is coming soon. I am so proud of who you built yourself into. Not despite what happened to you, though it would have been easier without it, but in the full complicated truth of everything you carried and everything you chose. You chose so well, baby. You always did. I read it 4 times in my car in the parking lot of Meadow Ridge. Then I folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in the inside pocket of my bag, close to my chest, where I have kept it ever since. Caleb called me the week after the funeral. Not a surface call. Not a holiday text. A real call. The kind that takes a minute to start because the person on the other end has been working up to it. I want to talk about when we were kids, he said. I think I understood some things wrong for a very long time. I think so too. I don't know how to do this exactly. A long pause. But I want to try, if you're willing. I thought about Marcus and Lily, about Grandma Rue's eyes in a 2-year-old's face, about what it means to let a cycle continue versus what it costs to be the person who decides it stops here. I'm willing, I said. Let's try. Here is what I know now that I didn't know at 7 years old, standing at a Sunoco pump on Route 9 in July with my fists balled up at my sides. The lesson my father thought he was teaching me that day was about gratitude, about knowing your place, about understanding that you could be left, and therefore you should be grateful you hadn't been yet. That was not the lesson I learned. What I actually learned, standing on that concrete in the July heat, was something my father never intended to teach and probably never understood he'd given me. I learned that I could be left in an unfamiliar place with nothing, and I could stand there, and I could hold myself upright, and I could wait, and I could be okay. Not comfortable, not unafraid, but okay, intact, still myself. That lesson, the real one, the accidental one, followed me through every hard thing that came after. Through college on a scholarship and 2 jobs and $43. Through a career built on instincts sharpened by surviving. Through every room I walked into where I had to stay steady while someone else fell apart. Through an intake office in May where I sat beside the man who left me and helped him sign the papers for the next chapter of his life with the same steady hands he never knew he'd built. He thought he was teaching me what it felt like to be abandoned. He taught me instead what it felt like to stand on my own. I have been standing on my own ever since, and when the time came, I used everything he accidentally gave me to do for him what he could no longer do for himself. That is not revenge. It is something far more powerful than revenge. It is becoming someone your damage could not stop you from becoming. If you are listening to this right now and someone left you somewhere, at a gas station, at the edge of a family portrait, at the margins of a life that never quite made room for you, I want you to hear this directly. They thought they were teaching you your place. They were actually teaching you your strength. You just didn't know it yet. And you don't have to forgive them to use what they gave you. You don't have to resolve the story to walk forward in it. You don't have to wait for the apology to start building.